Thank you so much, Allison, for that introduction and also for inviting me to be here. I am going to try and share slides. Okay, everyone can see slides.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so yeah, as I said, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I am looking forward to sharing this work, which is a recently published article. It came out, I think, at the end of last year. Though, as with many academic enterprises, it took a lot longer to get there, to get published. And so some of the examples and things that I'm drawing on are outdated, if you can believe it, from even last year. So I'm talking today about the role of public shaming in democratic life, why it sometimes works, why it oftentimes doesn't work, and what that means for how we understand cases of online public shaming as a form of social sanctioning. And so this is really motivated by the fact that in recent years, it seems like every time that we were turning around, there was a new example of the internet being used to shame people for violating some kind of social norms, from the very serious to the very superficial. So I'll run through some examples just to give you a sense of the kind of thing we're talking about. In 2005, we saw the quote unquote dog poop girl who refused to clean up after her dog on a train. In 2013, we saw Justine Sacco, who tweeted a racist joke about South Africa. We saw two software developers who were fired after making sexist jokes at a tech conference. And we saw Amy Cooper's publicized meltdown as the Central Park Karen in 2020. The result of the sort of culture of all of these things is, as open letter put it, that the quote, free exchange of information and ideas is daily becoming more constricted. And censoriousness is spreading more widely in our culture, as evidenced by, among other things, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism. In other words, the kind of online shaming or cancel culture that's ushered in by social media and the internet is understood to be a fundamental problem for democracy. At least that's what people say. The question that I'm asking is cancel culture really a problem? Is there a role of shame for a democratic society? And if so, how can we ensure that online shamings are filling that role? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So just to give you a sense of how my remarks are outlined, I'll first say a few words to sort of sketch the conditions under which public shaming might be a valuable way to sanction social norm violations. I'll then turn to the example of Amy Cooper, who again was nicknamed the Central Park Karen, to make the case that online public shaming doesn't often work, but not because of the internet's scale, as many people believe, but rather because of the ways that publics are organized on social media platforms like Twitter, or X now. I'll then discuss another case where online public shaming did work productively to help govern functioning democratic communities, and sort of talk about some of the ways that social media platforms and digital spaces complicate this picture about networks a little bit more. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts on how this attentiveness to the ways that online platforms structure our relationships might inform discussions of public shaming and social sanctioning, both on and offline. So in short, if you take away nothing else, take away the main idea, which is that I'm arguing that the problems with online public shaming are not due to the scale of social media, but are rather attributable to the kinds of relationships that these platforms create among users. So there's a role for public shaming in democratic life. And I think that the sort of theoretical framework that I'm giving in this paper can help us identify ways to effectively use online public shaming as a form of democratic social control, both online and offline. So I think, again, everyone probably knows what online shaming looks like, but because I am a political theorist, I will be very clear with this concept. I'm focusing in this paper on a type of sanctioning practice that takes place between citizens or people. So it's when people engage in public moral criticism in response to violations or perceived violations of social norms. So the goal of public shaming is twofold. First, it motivates individual behavioral change and by instilling feelings of shame or guilt in the norm violator, encouraging them to accept responsibility and take reparative action. So it changes the sort of behavior of the person who violated the norm. But it also helps reinforce those social norms more broadly by acting as a deterrent against norm violations by other people. If you watch somebody get shamed, you're not going to want to do that thing. And social and public shaming can be a valuable form of democratic social control precisely because it's horizontal. It consists of people holding one another to account, even and especially in cases where there's no recourse to formal authority. So public shaming is one potentially valuable way to ensure that people adhere to, for example, the democratic norms of equality, and that they do not engage in norm violations of that principle by engaging in things like hate speech. And we know from empirical research that shaming can work really, really well at doing both of these things. We also know, however, that while shame can serve an important role in social sanctioning, it doesn't always do this. There's a lot of evidence that shame punishments can not only misfire, but can also backfire, that being shamed can actually lead to disengagement and resentment rather than atonement and repair. So, what influences whether public shaming succeeds or fails? Scholars have identified 4 social conditions required for effective public shamings. The first is the presence of shared norms. For public shamings to work as a method of social sanction, it requires that the shamers or the targets of shaming have a shared sense of what the norms are and why violations are a problem. So, you can't effectively shame somebody if they don't know even what you're sort of talking about. For public shaming to effectively sanction these norm violations, however, it's not enough that those norms exist. Both the targets of shaming and the audience must recognize that the shamers have the authority to control the actions of the shamed. You have to sort of respect the person shaming you as someone who can legitimately exercise that kind of power over you. And without these 2 things, public shamings are likely to fail, and they might even result in what scholars call a shame backlash, where the person doing the shaming actually gets most of the sanctioning. In addition to recognizing the shamer's authority to sanction violations of shared norms, effective public shaming also depends on the presence of reputational considerations on the part of the shamed. So because public shaming is a reputational punishment, the only real thing that it sort of gets to you in terms of punishment is that it hurts your reputation or your standing within the community. So you have to care about your reputation if the public shaming is going to be corrective. And finally, for public shaming to work as a form of positive social control rather than a process of stigmatization, harassment, or worse, it has to occur in a context where there's the possibility of reintegration. So the person being shamed has to be given the opportunity to atone for their norm violation and to be accepted back into the community without stigma. So once this process has completed, everything has to go back to normal and you can't be sort of further ostracized. There's a difference between ostracization and public shaming. So you can think about how public shaming works, these 4 conditions, by thinking of a quiet car on a rail line or a bus maybe in an early morning commute. There are shared, although informal, norms of quietness in these spaces. It's unlikely that you're going to get officially punished or reprimanded for violating them, though quiet cars sort of vary on that. But people in these spaces tend to recognize one another's authority. So if someone shushes you on the bus, you understand that they have the authority to do so because you are in a public space and they are a member of the public. If public shaming is going to work, though, and to get you to change your behavior, you also have to be the kind of person who cares what people on the bus think about you. And this is more likely to happen in situations like regular commuting, where you see the same people over and over again. Finally, once you've apologized and you're quiet again, everyone kind of goes about their business. So you're not continually sort of, again, ostracized as being a deviant for this kind of norm violation. And so the reason why shaming works so well in those kinds of spaces is because they're characterized by what sociologists call a closed network structure. This is a community where people have many overlapping connections, like a school where parents all know each other, or a workplace where people frequently run into each other over and over again. It's because we have many connections to each other, both first degree and beyond. It means that people we know also know one another. So if you look at the closed network picture on the slide, right, the red person has many people that they have in common with others, which means that there's more people around to sanction. It means that people's reputation matters more. There's more places or lines of communication for your bad reputation to spread. The closed network makes it more likely that the people in the network share norms with one another just because there's more connections, and it's more likely that they care what others think. It's more likely also then that we know how to apologize because there's a defined community that we can apologize to. So it's in a closed network structure, I argue, that shaming is more likely to work. So there's a lot you could say about these 4 conditions, the community structure and shame sanctioning more generally. I'm happy to talk about those in our discussion or the Q&A. But the question that I want to focus on for the rest of my talk is on what this means for how we understand online public shaming. So people tend to agree that online public shaming is a problem, even though those people who think that there is a role for public shaming in democratic life tend to agree that shamings on social media, and in particular on Twitter, now X, are a step too far, right? That this is cancel culture run amok. And in order to show why this is the case, that's sort of the argument that they're making, and also why I think that it is an incomplete explanation, I want to consider the case of Amy Cooper. So Amy Cooper was the Central Park Karen who called the cops on a black birder named Chris Cooper, which is really confusing. But she, on the phone call, invoked his race after he asked her to leash her dog, as the park's rules require. So she was in violation of the park's rules. He asked her to leash her dog, and she called the cops. So the Amy Cooper case is a pretty typical case of online public shaming and the sort of process that it goes through. So first, an individual's bad behavior, oftentimes racist or sexist, is uploaded to social media where it begins to circulate, oftentimes aided by high follower accounts who retweet it and hashtags that begin to trend. The person's behavior then becomes the subject of intense scrutiny on these platforms. And as part of this process, many times other users will dox the target of shaming, often calling for real-world punishments by revealing personal information like the target's name, their location, and their employer, that are all drawn from other social media accounts or other public sources of information. So this is exactly what happened to Amy Cooper. She was almost immediately identified. Her name became a trending topic on Twitter very quickly. And by the end of the day that it had been uploaded, so May 25th, 2020, she had lost her job. She was forced to surrender her dog. She was being charged with filing a false police report. In exchange for jail time, she completed a restorative justice process, and she apologized not only to Christian Cooper, who was the birder, but also more broadly to, quote, everyone who was offended. And we'll talk about that apology a little bit later. So far, so good. It sounds like the shaming worked, right? She was shamed for her behavior, she apologized, and we move on. Not really, though. 1 year later, it was clear that Cooper had not changed her behavior at all and had not really taken seriously on the sanctioning. So she sued her former employer, alleging that she did not call the police because she's racist. She did these things because she was alone in the park and frightened to death after being selected as the next target of Christian Cooper. So rather than acknowledging the censure for being shamed for her racist behavior the year prior, Cooper once again in this example engaged in precisely the kind of dog whistling for which she was shamed previously. Right, so it is not clear that she was motivated by shame to change her behavior or to not do it again. So what went wrong here? Oftentimes people who argue that online public shaming is a problem lay the blame on the scale that social media introduced into public life. So the problem with online shaming in this argument is that there's just too much of it. There's too many people doing the sanctioning, which makes proportional responses all but impossible. So this is the argument of the quote on the side is from an argument by Harrison Fry, who makes this case pretty persuasively. But what I want to argue is that scale is not only the issue that we should be thinking about. Instead, what I want to convince you of is that it is also the social structure of the social media platforms, the underlying social networks that they create among users that led online public shaming to fail in cases like Amy Cooper's. And the difference here is a small but meaningful one. So scale refers to the number of people involved in something, while structure emphasizes the relationships between them. And what matters for online shaming, again, or shaming more generally, is whether or not the network of people involved is open or closed, meaning that it's whether or not people share a lot of connections with one another or whether they don't. So while small-scale networks are oftentimes denser, meaning they're more closed, the two are conceptually distinct, and I think it's important that we keep that distinction in mind. There are various institutional and environmental characteristics, like a professional organization or a conference hall or a neighborhood, that make large-scale closed networks possible. And so we should just be wary of that. And so we can see the importance of structure by looking more closely at the case of Amy Cooper and Twitter. So the Amy Cooper example, like many or most cases of online public shaming, did take place on Twitter back when it was Twitter. And Twitter is an open network. So this image on the side is from a Pew study in 2014 that was looking at the ways that people talked to each other on Twitter. And so what they found is that unlike a platform like unlike a platform like Facebook, most Twitter relationships are asymmetrical, right? So they are unreciprocated. So the people I follow on Twitter may not follow me, and our networks might have very few people in common. This open network structure can be really politically valuable, and I'm happy to talk more about that as well. But it is also why I want to argue that online public shaming largely fails in those spaces. In short, the open structure of Twitter makes it difficult for users to cultivate the social conditions required for shaming to work. Because of the way Twitter structures its user relationships, there's no real sense of shared norms, let alone collective authority. Likewise, because of its open network, Twitter users are unlikely to develop the kind of reputational considerations that are required for shame to work. There's just not any real sense that users are going to like encounter one another again if they are only meeting on Twitter. And finally, even if users do want to atone for their misbehavior on Twitter, there's no real body for them to apologize to. The targets of public shaming cannot reintegrate into a community if the community doesn't exist. And I want to argue that it doesn't if we're just looking at a site like Twitter. And I think this helps explain the Cooper case. So the shaming that Amy Cooper faced was not really an example of collective sanctioning. It wasn't the expression of a community's shared norms or the collective authority to sanction one of their own. Rather, it was more like a kind of aggregation of individual opinions with nothing really tying them together with any weight. And the result is that it's not clear really why Amy Cooper should have cared about her reputation among the Twitter users that she encountered. It also wasn't clear who she needed to satisfy or how she could even have done that in order to be reintegrated into that community, because again, that community didn't exist. So she was apologizing sort of into the ether. And so I think we shouldn't be surprised that the result for Cooper and others like her was stigmatization, not productive sanctioning. But just because Twitter is badly designed for public shaming doesn't mean that this is true for all of the internet or even all of social media. In fact, I think there are really interesting examples of well-functioning digital communities that do use public shaming in productive ways to get people to contribute to public goods or to motivate the kind of critical self-reflection that we know is important in democratic politics. So I will conclude by briefly highlighting one of these examples, Reddit. The paper talks about Wikipedia as well, so I'm happy to talk about some other examples. This is not just a Reddit thing, although there are good reasons why it is. So for those who are unfamiliar, Reddit was founded in 2005 and is a popular link sharing website. It has or had at the time that I wrote this about 330 million monthly active users and around 140,000 active subreddits that are organized around a variety of topics. So topics range on the platform from things like cute animals to politics to NBA teams, all sorts of other interests, from really popular things like movies to really obscure or niche things like political philosophy. And Reddit is really a community that maintains itself largely through the existence and enforcement of informal social norms. So the site is huge and the company is very small. And so most of the moderation and most of the sanctioning and rule enforcement is done in the communities themselves by volunteer moderators from the community. And so what I want to highlight in this discussion is how the effective norm enforcement used on Reddit is tied to the platform's underlying structure. So the argument that I'm making is that the way that Reddit is designed shapes the way that people interact with one another and makes social sanctioning or like public shaming more effective. So just again, for those who maybe don't know how the site works, you sort of interact with Reddit through things called subreddits, which are discrete spaces like neighborhoods that facilitate closed networks. So the picture on the screen is a picture of the subreddit for Chicago. And so if you go in here, like there's a group of people who regularly looks at our Chicago, and you are more likely to run into them and they are more likely to have connections within subreddits. There are also clearly expressed shared norms, and other Redditors' authority to sanction those norms is well recognized in the community. So again, these are the rules for our Chicago, and everybody sort of knows that those are the rules, and they are enforced both by moderators and by other users. Reputation also matters a great deal on Reddit, and this is reflected in what they call karma. So Redditors gain karma when they do good things on the platform, when they post that people really like, and they lose it when their content is downvoted, for example. They do something that's sort of against type. So users' karma is displayed on their profiles, which gives other people an immediate sense of their reputation on the site. They kind of know who they're dealing with. And reputation karma also sort of gets people's content boosted in the algorithm, so it's more likely that you will sort of see it. In short, Reddit has a closed network structure that's facilitated by its platform design, and this makes public shaming sanctioning more effective by providing the kind of social conditions that public shaming requires. And this context means that public shamings on Reddit play out very differently than they do for people like Amy Cooper on Twitter. So I will give an example to show this. So the Redditor with the username European Douchebag, which is quite appropriate, posted a photo to our funny of a Sikh woman who had untrimmed facial hair. And he posted this to the subreddit expecting that the other 2.5 million members of the community would find it funny. That is the whole point of the subreddit. Soon, however, the post gained national media attention, and other users, other commenters began to shame European douchebag, saying things like, he picked a great username, don't do this, don't take pictures of people that you think look funny. I conclude from this post that you're a douchebag, this is a bad idea, etc. After he first doubled down on his original position in the comments, European Douchebag later apologized for this post, saying our funny wasn't the proper place to post this. Maybe our racism or our douchebags of Reddit or our intolerance would have been more appropriate. And just so you know, those are not real subreddits. So what he's doing is basically saying like this was not appropriate for the website at all. In this example, we can see European Douchebag not only apologizing, but doing so in a way that not only clearly identifies how he violated the specific shared norms of our funny, but also recognizes that his fellow Redditors had the authority to sanction his actions. And we can contrast this apology with Cooper's, which was vaguely aimed at, quote, everyone who's seen the video, everyone who's offended, and everyone who thinks of me in a lower light. So in her apology, it's not clear what norm she's violating. It's not clear who she's talking to. And I think that's because she doesn't know who she's talking to or what norms she's violating, right? That context is not clear to her. European Douchebag's posts also revealed the importance of his reputation. He notes that he made the original post for stupid internet points, and he comments later that he hopes, quote unquote, you guys, meaning the other Redditors, won't remember me as that douchebag that posted the picture of the Sikh girl. And the commenters sort of respond really productively to these remarks and apologies. While there are plenty of people who remained skeptical of the apology, most of the comments afterwards applaud him for apologizing, saying things again, it's refreshing to see someone apologize. You have my upvote, which means like I support this. They also recognize that he's atoned for his original norm violation, right? So a lot of people are like, I think it's cool that you know that what you did was wrong and accept this, so on. And so when we compare European Douchebag's experience to the Amy Cooper case, we can see some striking similarities and differences. Both of them involved a private two-person interaction that ultimately made national news and resulted in shamings on two large-scale social media platforms. But the social context of the two shamings varied considerably. So on Reddit, the shaming occurs within a closed social structure facilitated by the platform's subreddit design. And as a result, European Douchebag was able to contextualize the shaming as a response from a cohesive community of which he was a member. And he responded in exactly the kind of way that we would like to see, right? He apologized and everybody moved on. For Amy Cooper, however, the shaming was conducted within the open network structure of Twitter, where it was less clear who was doing the shaming, for what purpose, and why she should care, right? The community context was missing. And so, again, that we shouldn't be surprised, but the shaming was ineffective. And so what all of this sort of means, I think, is that if we attend to the social structure and sort of focus on the relationship between the people involved, we can see that the salient difference between these two cases is not reducible to scale. So certainly there is a difference in the number of people involved, but I don't know that there's a real meaningful human difference between 2.5 million people and 100 million people. They're both like outside the scale of normal human interactions. Rather, the difference is attributable, I think, to the spaces that are created by these platforms and the networks of users that they facilitate, and how those different attributes create different social contexts that help to determine whether online public shaming was an effective form of social sanctioning or a vehicle for stigmatization. So this all seems nice and tidy, but the story is actually a little bit more complicated. And so I'll just sort of get into that a little bit before wrapping up. And that's because one day after he apologized and everything was nice and great, European Douchebag deleted his account. And he did this in a way that echoed the sentiments of other people who were subject to high-profile online public shamings. And so his goodbye message, which is on the screen now, highlighted the kind of vitriol and relentlessness of the kind of responses that he got to his relatively low-stakes norm violation. So he said in his comment where he said, I'm deleting my account, being constantly reminded of a stupid post I made is kind of awful. All the people telling me I should kill myself and that I'm a terrible person is pretty bad too. I'm just a normal dude who made a dumb mistake. So this is a pretty common refrain from subjects of online public shaming or victims of online public shaming. But I want to suggest that there is a little bit more going on here, and that, again, structure can help us understand what happened. So the example of European Douchebag, as I argued, suggests that closed networks like the Our Funny subreddit can help to mitigate some of the pathologies associated with large-scale online public shaming, right? It is because of closed networks that the shamings are more likely to be effective. But I also think that this example then, especially if we think about the fact that he deleted his account at the end of the day, that this example highlights the ways that digital technologies and social media platforms in particular oftentimes facilitate network structures that transcend a simple distinction between open and closed in ways that complicate online public shaming and how we understand it. But I'd still think that a focus on structure can help us untangle on some of the seeming contradiction in the fact that while European douchebag did eventually delete his account, citing these kind of common pathologies, he seemingly also had a productive shaming experience. And so I think network structure can help us understand why that's the case. For one, the case of European douchebag or Reddit shows how easily online public shaming can move between networks and have different effects because of that. Crucially, while European douchebag shaming initially occurred within the relatively closed network of R Funny, it did not remain contained in that original context, right? As I mentioned, the shaming escaped that context when the incident was publicized. It was covered by news media like Huffington Post and CNN. It was covered on other subreddits like Gold Reddit Says, which is like a subreddit where people talk about what's happening in other subreddits, feminism and default gems. Even all of these also had thousands of members that were not connected to the original R Funny community. And so the result was that European douchebag was soon subject to shaming in many different contexts, not only in the closed network of R Funny, but also in the more open networks of Reddit more generally and the media sort of more broadly. And again, I think as might be expected, it is once the shaming escaped this original network of R Funny that it became less productive and less pathological. So the shift that we saw in European douchebag's sort of experience is again a shift not of scale, but of structure. Likewise, in demonstrating the ease with which online public shaming can escape these specific networks online, this example of Reddit also shows how the structure of interactions on social media platforms can sometimes resist the easy distinction or classification into open and closed networks. As I've been arguing, R Funny is a more closed network from the perspective of its members, especially compared to something like Twitter. But it's important to note that it's not like hermetically sealed. It is a page that anyone can visit. You don't have to be a member of the community. And so we might say that content on R Funny or Reddit more generally is accessible to lurkers, right? People who are not members. Anyone can read the exchanges without participating in them. People can read what's going on without even being visible to the actual members of the subreddit. So they have actually no idea who's looking in at their conversations. And again, I think this can explain the trajectory of European douchebag shaming, right? It was non-member observers of the community, like journalists, who actually moved the shaming from a single closed network into multiple more open networks when they publicized the story and sort of took it from its context. And so rather than retain the specificity of the context of the community where it happened, this shift meant that his behavior was soon subject to scrutiny from a lot of open network with vaguely defined publics that he didn't have the same kind of relationship with. And so the shaming took on characterization more like Cooper's on Twitter. And again, this was made possible because the initial shaming that took place within a closed community was visible to people outside of it. So again, network structure, I think, can help explain the apparent contradiction in European douchebag's online shaming experience. His shaming was actually both productive and pathological because it occurred in different kinds of networks simultaneously. So on the one hand, European douchebag could easily contextualize his initial shaming and respond to the rebuke from the R Funny members for what it was, right? It was a collective sanctioning for violating a shared community norm. This wasn't funny and you shouldn't have posted it. On the other hand, European douchebag's experience of public shaming also devolved into something that was characterized by harassment and harm when non-member observers took it from that closed context into the more open network of mass media. However, and this is sort of what I want to end on, I think, unlike Amy Cooper and others who have voiced these like similar concerns about the pathological nature, European douchebag continued to describe his experience as a positive and transformative one. So even after deciding to delete his account, he felt obligated to explain his decision to the community, and I think that's important. Even then, in this goodbye message, he insists that his apology was sincere. People can say what they want, but in my heart and hopefully hers, he apologized to the woman personally. He knows it was sincere, and he closes this all by saying that he was glad that so much positive stuff came from a negative post. Seriously. And so again, I think that this is like a way more complicated picture than just saying, oh, you can't have productive shamings online because of the scale. And rather, when we look at the network structure involved, we can understand why, in this case specifically, one person had such different reactions to the same kind of shaming, even though he cited an experience as characterized by certain pathologies that are similar to people like Amy Cooper's, right? It's the network structure that really matters here. So what should we do with all of this? First, it's my hope that this framework helps to clarify some of the stakes involved in online public shaming. I am a political theorist, and so conceptual clarity is some of what I'm trying to do generally. And I think that part of the goal is to clear up some of the confusion that I think is involved over debates about cancel culture so that we know what it is we're actually fighting about. For one, I think shifting our focus from just saying that the problem is the scale of social media, which would take public shaming off the table entirely, right? If the problem is one of scale, then we just can't do it anymore because there's no real small scale social networks. And instead, if we focus on the network structures of those involved in public shaming events, this opens up several new possibilities for us to sort of think about how to use this productively. So for one, we can think about how to implement some of the elements from platforms that successfully use online public shaming, right? So the fact that Reddit clearly posts norms that it expects community members to follow is one of the reasons that shaming works on the site. And so we might think of ways that we can incorporate that kind of mechanism, something to make norms more visible on sites like Twitter as a way to help set the conditions for shaming to be productive. And there's some research I can talk about from other people who's sort of experimented with this kind of thing. We can also think about how to build new platforms that might allow for these kinds of activities, right? So building platforms that look more like Reddit is probably more likely to facilitate that kind of behavior. I also think that it can help us know how to respond to online public shaming. And this is not as much in the paper, but it's something that I've been thinking a lot about just because of the contemporary context in the US. But it is oftentimes when we hear people debating about cancel culture, it comes in the context of college campuses, right? University campuses. And I think there's good reasons based on this paper and what I'm presenting here to think that like people just shouldn't really be that interested in what is going on in college campuses if you're not a member of the community, that there's a harm that's done not by the original shaming, public shaming, or cancel culture event in a closed community like a university campus. Rather, the harm comes when it's publicized and picked up by people who are not members of that community. It's certainly more complicated than that, but that's sort of one of the sort of offline, I think, implications as well. And ultimately, I think, or I hope that this argument or this paper can help us decide whether shaming is the appropriate sanctioning step to take in any given situation. We might just decide, hey, this isn't going to work and we shouldn't do it. And I think but knowing how to make that judgment call means that we have to be able to properly identify the problem, name it, and identify the conditions for its resolution. And so that is what I hoped that this paper is helping us do. And so I will leave it there, and I'm looking for a discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm very eager to hear what questions come up for people and to continue this conversation. So feel free to raise your hand or put something in chat, and I'm happy to read it out. Okay, while we wait for people to conceive of one, I will start. As I was listening to you, one of the things I was thinking about was that the examples that you were looking at were particularly people who would be understood as peers. And I think much of the public shaming that has happened since has a very real sense of power differential to the kind of narrative that happens with this is that public shaming is the only option because the systems are protecting the powerful, and therefore it's the only way to be able to shame someone who you can't otherwise touch. So I'm curious about that structural power dynamic that has become part of the narrative of public shaming and how that factors into this.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's tough because again, because I think that power and how we understand it is also dependent on the context or the network in which it's being played out. Because the power differential can go kind of both ways, right? It is true that public shaming is oftentimes a tool of the powerless. It's an attempt to, one of the only books that is like pro public shaming is by a woman named Jennifer Jaquette. And right, she's like, this is the only way that we can hold companies to account, right? Because they have so much power, and like, you have to shame them and boycott them for their practices, and it can be really effective. But part of that is again because the companies care about what consumers are doing, right? And so we can think about all these cases of people who were shamed, but it didn't actually do anything, right? So Louis C.K. was the comedian who sexually assaulted a bunch of women or harassed a bunch of women. And this was a case that I kept wrestling with as I was writing this, because there too, the power dynamic was in his favor. And I think at the end of the day, there, people just didn't care what the women had to say. And so the shaming was also not effective, even though that took place in a closed community, right? And so I think a closed network is more likely to help facilitate these kinds of conditions, but I don't think it is necessarily going to, right? It is necessary, but not sufficient. And so I think, yeah, gender is a huge part of this, race is a huge part of this, right? So because it's also the fact, this is a kind of a roundabout answer, it's also the case that almost all of the cases of online public shaming that are harassment are women who are the victims, right? And so there isn't also like the power differential flips there. People feel much more comfortable piling on to a woman on Twitter when she's vulnerable than they would, I think, a man. So it's harder to find cases of people who were shamed online who were men, just I think because it just doesn't happen as often, which is important.
Yeah, other questions? Otherwise, I've got another.
Yeah, there's only so much you can do in 12,000 words, which was my limit. Because it's our
Please take it. You're able to unmute?
You're asking me?
Yes.
Hi, thanks. This was really interesting. Really enjoyed the talk. And I think this is it strikes me as a very, how do I say, productive line of inquiry about these kinds of networks. Very useful way to sort of investigate the way that public spheres work and the way they allow different kinds of power to be exercised, right? Um, I and I found myself thinking about, especially when, you mentioned the Huffington Post and CNN as being sort of factors in this, right? And of course, I think we would say that they have quite different opennesses or closednesses, different structures to the networks that they produce. They're very, very different. And I'm wondering if there's maybe more to say about that. I mean, I think that online public shaming is an interesting thing. It's very much worth studying. But I wonder if there's also like a sort of a mass mediated version of public shaming that has maybe different dynamics. And if there's anything that maybe could be said about those kinds of networks and the kind of power that's exercised by the people in control of them. Is there any other research like that talks about that element of that kind of thing?
Could you maybe clarify or give me an example of something that you're talking about, like shaming by like media outlets
Well, two
instead of
different things I'm thinking. One is the way, I mean, you mentioned the Huffington Post, and it, I think, does a lot of what I'd consider celebrity gossip, and there's all kinds of work there trying to make one celebrity or another look terrible. But I don't follow that kind of stuff very closely, so I maybe don't know too much about it. But then the role that they do play, I find the interplay between the social media platforms and mass media systems to be very interesting, because it seems to me that a lot of what ends up going viral and creating this open network where there isn't really a possibility for the consequences to create effective public shaming, a lot of that seems to be driven by the mass media. Like, things go viral on platforms, but when the mass media start talking about them, that boosts that process. So there's those two ways that I was thinking about it. But if there's another way of thinking about that relationship, I'd be interested in hearing it.
Yeah, no, I think I agree. And I think one of the kind of surprising things, and something that I guess I'm not as comfortable with, and I maybe should be thinking more about as I think about how and whether to extend this line of inquiry, is that, you know, it kind of seems to me that one of the takeaways of this paper, and then maybe this is different from what you're asking, in which case we can you can ask again and I'll try better. But one of the takeaways, it seems, or implications, is that like the media just shouldn't be covering this stuff. And on the one hand, I'm like, that does seem right to me, right? Like, I don't know that we need media coverage of like the internal drama of a subreddit. I don't know that we need as much media coverage of like what's happening at Oberlin College over like their lunch menu or whatever, which is like a big cancel culture example, right? And so I think that that's right. On the other hand, again, going back to Allison's original question about power, I do think that it does seem like sometimes there are cases where increased visibility is helpful or necessary to sort of get a kind of pro-democratic result. And I think I guess I don't have a good sense yet of exactly when that line, or sort of when to make that judgment of like, this should go public and this should sort of remain maybe smaller scale or more closed. But I do think that that's also a piece that needs to be considered. And so one of the things, to think about is that open and closed networks are actually only one way to think about network structure. And there's a lot of other network analysis type stuff that you can do. So you could also think about like people who have multiple networks on top of each other, right? So people who are like have the same job and also are in the same family, like have overlapping networks, but like the networks are very different, and that might change the way shaming works, sometimes. You can also think about people's like place in the network. It might be more effective to shame someone that's a more central node than it is someone who's like, closer to the outskirts. So all of that is, I think, stuff that we should just be thinking more about, but you can't do that if you think that the problem is scale. And so one of the takeaways is like a plea for like, please just like focus on other stuff than scale, take it more seriously. But I do think that there are these kinds of like other considerations about like, when does visibility help and when not. And one of the comments that I got from a reviewer, and I think isn't like a footnote because I didn't have enough space, is it was totally right, is like closed networks are also really dangerous, right? Like closed networks are a problem, especially if we're talking about a democratic society. People can online or public shaming can work really, really well, but it's like you're wearing a red letter on your chest because you were sexually assaulted or something, right? Like that's like the norms of your community are not helpful or democratic or in the service of equality. And that too is a problem. And that's maybe a place where and intersecting networks can help open the kind of norms that we're thinking about, not just how they're enforced. But again, like that's in order to get there, you have to be thinking about the way networks intersect and the kinds of norms.
I'll ask another, which is really prompted by the last one. And this thinking about the influence of culture and the benefits for people economically of going viral. And so I think that helps perhaps to shape the influence of scale, that when there is incentive to scale out outrage, which we very much see both economically and politically, there are real incentives to build scale around outrage. The scale becomes effectively the weapon of the shaming. And so it's interesting because I think what you're saying about open and closed networks makes sense. It's maybe the capacity of the scale that I think is kind of interesting as opposed to the existence of the scale.
Yeah. I mean, I also don't want to be too like, it's not scale. Like getting hundreds of thousands of messages saying like you should kill yourself is a horrible thing for anybody to have to read. Like unambiguously agree that that's a problem. But I do think it is a difference to say, to, for example, get what are like random messages from people. And so most public shamings, most people are not actually saying like you should jump off a cliff or something, or I hope you die. They're saying like, oh, they're like dunking on you, right? They're like making fun of you, which also doesn't feel good, but it doesn't carry the same, I think, like threat or harm. But targeted harassment is not like that, right? It is like a group of people are coordinating to like go after this person in order to run them off of Twitter, and like they've been successful. But there again, like I think that that's also a network structure thing, right? That there's a difference between like disorganized mass messages coming at you that are like all over the place in terms of content, and like a coordinated harassment campaign where people are actually organizing in one space. And so they're talking to each other, and there's more coordination and overlapping connections going on in this kind of closed community. And the results that we see are on Twitter, and the two on Twitter might look very similar, right? It's just like one person being targeted by a bunch of messages, but they like feel different, I think, to the person involved. And they also are different, again, in terms of the power dynamic, right? The collective action of a group against one person seems to me to be of a different kind than an aggregation of individuals talking to one person. And there again, I think we oftentimes see the latter, right? The coordinated attacks being used to target more vulnerable people online. And I think that again is speaking to the power part of it. You have more power in a closed network where you have more coordination.
Thank you so much. This has been such a fascinating talk. And thank you
you.
everyone for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.